Part 7. Metaphysical Psychopathy. It is only after a thorough and, shall we say, more terrestrial exploration of psychopathy that we now venture into the more challenging aspects of the condition. To hastily and eccentrically proclaim that all psychopaths are reptilian shapeshifters without any prior critical analysis of the disorder serves only to undermine psychopathy's true nature and distracts from credible, biologically oriented research on the subject. At the same time, only addressing psychopathy from a strictly scientific angle serves to equally distort psychopathy's reality. It is important to realize that any information in of itself is neutral in value. Information viewed through the lenses of critical and intuitive awareness becomes knowledge. Knowledge, with deep absorption and spiritual insight, becomes wisdom, and the application of this wisdom through direct experience becomes gnosis. It is with a clear consciousness that we can approach metaphysical reality in a self-empowering way. In addressing psychopathy with such clear awareness, we come to realize that the condition indeed manifests as a debased or altogether absent capacity for higher emotional awareness, due predominantly to a lack of the sacred feminine spiritual essence. As previously stated, the intellect of the mind, the intuition of the heart, and the active volition of the will form the trivium of holistic human consciousness. These energetic aspects of awareness are not separate, rather they are interdependent, and thus are either in harmonious or disharmonious communication with one another. In this model, the psychopath's absence or otherwise low vibrational quality of heart-based emotional energy poorly engages or altogether fails to engage the right hemisphere of the neocortex and the old mammalian physiology of the limbic brain. That is, it is not exclusively the psychopathic brain in itself that is defective. Rather, the psychopath lacks the spiritual resonance necessary to activate aspects of their genetic coding responsible for proper neurophysiological development. Masculine spiritual energy is channeled as the intellectual consciousness of the mind and is translated by the left hemisphere of the neocortex. Feminine spiritual energy is channeled as the intuitive and emotional consciousness of the heart, which is then further translated by the right hemisphere of the neocortex. Psychopathy is a spiritual deficiency, one that is overly masculine and left-brained, lacking the spiritual harmony of the divine feminine essence and this energy's accompanied interface with the brain's right hemisphere. The union of sacred male and female energy gives birth to divine free will, as the threefold harmonization of thoughts, emotions, and willful action embodies holistic intelligence, the true divine potential of higher human consciousness. The overly male, predatory behavior of the psychopath is far from divine and represents an imbalanced, lower vibrational consciousness. It is this particular psychopathic resonance that tends to facilitate a parasitic spiritual relationship with an energetically compatible type of fourth density consciousness, a non-human intelligence that is also manifested without the harmonic balance of male and female unity. Existing in the spiritual realm are certain ultra-terrestrial intelligences, beings that have not yet risen beyond the polarization of positive and negative forces, and are in themselves far from the divine. Such dark spiritual beings remain distorted by inversions of self-conceit and destruction, as these entities are still very much compelled by attraction and repulsion in the good versus evil dynamics of extreme polarity. Contained in a realm that is still subject to entropy, these entities require a source of power, just as human beings need food to be physically sustained. Lower density human consciousness is a prime target for this fourth density sustenance, so long as it is of the same resonance, albeit an octave lower, as the consciousness it is channeled into. The self-conceiting and destructive nature of psychopathic consciousness, with its male imbalance and lower vibratory density, thus readily entices this malevolent ultra-terrestrial intelligence. On a metaphysical level, the disease of psychopathy can be considered as a type of low spiritual immunity that attracts these non-human, ultra-dimensional parasites. Such inorganic beings identify certain energy oscillations, such as consciousness of a psychopathic variety, using its perpetual emanation of low vibrational consciousness as energetic nourishment to stave off the entropy they remain subject to in the fourth density realm. It is not exclusively psychopathic consciousness that is fed upon by these spiritual predators, however, for low human consciousness in general can serve as an energetic source of sustenance. But it is the constant state of low-density consciousness emanated by the psychopath that is fine-tuned for the male-dominant energy of these predators, supremely allowing for an established symbiotic relationship between the spiritual parasite and psychopathic host. Predominantly, this spiritual parasitic infection would not be consciously known to the psychopathic individual. Rather, the psychopath would perceive their cruel and unnatural urges as exclusively their own, remaining for the most part unaware of the dark spiritual persuasion that may be partially responsible for influencing their destructive behavior. The spiritual parasite channels or interfaces their essence with the psychopath's consciousness. Thus this, for lack of a less loaded term, spiritual possession, is more than likely a type of unconscious collaborative relationship from the perspective of the human host. But particularly with the Illuminists of the ruling class, a scenario emerges in which practicing psychopathic occultists may indeed be aware of, and in actuality commune with, these non-human spiritual personalities, perhaps even intentionally channeling or merging with certain dark entities in the further fulfillment of their own twisted spiritual and predatory desires. Let us consult the wisdom of our ancestors for more insight into these dark, ultra-terrestrial entities. Many spiritual traditions, in fact, speak of these malevolent, supernatural beings. It is modern man's grossly material and nearsighted scientific worldview that rejects such an astonishing reality. Traditionally, these spiritual entities have been quite colorfully described, for instance with their more commonly known labeling seen in several examples including the archons, the jinn, the Orions, the devils, and the demons. They have been known as the Black Wings, the Holes, the Flyers, and yes, even as the infamous so-called shape-shifting reptilians. The cartoonishly vivid and eccentric baggage that often accompanies such descriptions should not detract from the quite serious and very real nature of these predators, however. When the human mind comes into contact with fourth density reality, it often interprets such energetic information using whatever references it is familiar with in an attempt to make sense of the encounter. Thus the vivid and at times bizarre descriptions that accompany such contact with ultra-terrestrial entities is not as odd as it initially may seem to be. The congruent seen in such imaginative constructs can perhaps be explained by the collective mythos inherent to a specific class of individuals, as well as the particular geographic region where such encounters take place, as such a direct spiritual contact with fourth density reality becomes a permanent artifact in this energetic field, an artifact that may further the energetic permanence of a certain narrative as it is experientially reinforced by many different individuals over time. To further explore such supernatural adversaries, let us turn our attention to the mystical philosophy of pre-Christian Gnosticism and the text of the Nag Hammadi library. From the opening paragraph of the tractate The Hypostasis of the Archons, the Apostle Paul is stated as saying humanity's, quote, contest is not against flesh and blood, rather the authorities of the universe and the spirits of wickedness, unquote. The word authorities here is the widely understood terminology for the archons, spiritual ruling entities that represent the malevolent, ultra-terrestrial consciousness comprising level 7 of our pyramidal model. Such dark, inorganic beings are indeed deeply involved in the affairs of this world, perhaps even playing a role in the creation of the physical world itself. Roger Bullard's introduction to the Hypostasis of the Archons expounds upon this opening text by stating, quote, the reality of the archontic rulers. Far from being merely fictitious, imaginary powers, the archons are all too real. These rulers indeed exist. This is a grim reality for the Christian Gnostics, who define their own spiritual nature in opposition to that of the ruling and enslaving authorities." Unquote. One of many possible narratives emerges here, whereby in some darkening age of our ancient past, a specific genetic lineage of individuals with an already compromised consciousness who would one day come to rule humanity may have been engaged by this non-human spiritual consciousness, and due perhaps to impressive non-temporal illusions and seemingly powerful displays of godlike fourth-density magic, as well as clever appeals to vulnerable human egos, this dark spiritual intelligence may have won favor, worship, and even willful allegiance, perhaps even deeming this specific group of individuals as being such an impostor God's so-called chosen people. In exchange for worldly power and potential dominion over the physical realm, this naive class may have been made privy to specific high knowledge and granted certain conscious abilities in exchange for the willing degradation of their spiritual integrity. The intense pride and egotistical madness that accompanied being such a false god's so-called chosen people may have compelled this class to begin the ages-old process of meticulous interbreeding with one another. Such forced unions of planned sexual copulation were not carried out in the name of love, as is the natural way of procreation, but instead were performed in the name of dark, egotistical intentions of selfishness and an unnatural self-conceit. This dark procreation may have perpetually degraded this future ruling class's spiritual essence, eventually leading to a completely separate and essentially inhuman race of individuals, deeply immersed in a psychopathic and overtly male modality of being. This psychopathic race of people, again for lack of less loaded terminology, may have willingly sold their soul at some point in time in the ancient world, in exchange for the pleasures and powers that accompany dominating the whole of material reality, in essence being cleverly persuaded and bargained by this malevolent spiritual consciousness to darkly collaborate in the transformation of a formerly free earth into what has essentially become a soul farm for the harvesting of low-fidelity human consciousness in order for such spiritual parasites to sustain themselves in fourth-density reality. This predatory consciousness would undoubtedly require a constant appeasement of energetic sustenance, thus the constant blood-sacrificing, cyclical mass mega-rituals, and constant reinforcement of a psychopathic social construct forever is upheld, lest the ruling class suffer extreme consequence, in all probability existing under the constant threat of losing their current domineering status, as well as whatever additional benefits they have gained from such a relationship. Such a scenario represents just one possibility of the so-called fall of man scenario, and we shall momentarily explore other hypotheses. But one thing is certain. The similarity seen between the predatory techniques of the ruling class and the predatory techniques of this inhuman spiritual consciousness is a congruence that cannot be ignored.